The first shells screamed across the Pacific dawn like vengeful spirits, their whistling crescendo shattering the tropical silence that had cloaked Saipan for centuries. It was June 15th, 1944, and the largest naval bombardment in Pacific War history was about to transform this peaceful Mariana Island into a crucible of modern warfare. Admiral Raymond Spruan stood on the bridge of the USS Indianapolis, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched 7 battleships and 11 cruisers unleash their fury upon the Japanese defenses. The thunder was so overwhelming that it seemed to shake the very ocean itself, sending vibrations through the steel deck that resonated in the bones of every sailor present. This was Operation Forager, America's bold thrust into the heart of Japan's Pacific Empire, and Saipan was the key that would unlock the door to Tokyo Bay. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, had spent months studying every ridge, every beach, every cave system that intelligence could identify on this 14-mile-long island. The Japanese had turned Saipan into a fortress, with Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato commanding over 30,000 troops, who had sworn to die rather than surrender. The island's volcanic terrain provided natural defensive positions that the Japanese had enhanced with concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and an intricate network of caves that could shelter entire battalions. According to historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the pre-invasion bombardment consumed more ammunition in 2 days than the entire Pacific Fleet had used in the first year of the war. The sheer scale of destruction was unprecedented. Yet American planners knew that Japanese defenders had proven remarkably resilient to even the most intensive bombardments throughout the Pacific Campaign. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the 27th Infantry Division, comprised the assault force of over 70,000 men. These were seasoned veterans who had cut their teeth on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Marshall Islands, but Saipan represented something different. This wasn't just another stepping stone in the island-hopping campaign. It was Japan's inner defensive perimeter, a place the enemy would defend with unprecedented ferocity because its fall would bring American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. As the bombardment reached its climax, landing craft began forming up in the coral blue waters off the western beaches. The humid tropical air carried the acrid smell of curdite and the sweet scent of burning vegetation, while columns of black smoke rose like funeral pyres from the island's interior. Marine Corporal James Bradley, clutching his rifle in the bow of his landing craft, watched the shoreline through the smoke and wondered if the intensive bombardment had truly softened the Japanese defenses or merely driven them deeper underground. The Japanese defenders, crouched in their reinforced positions, felt the earth shake with each incoming shell, but maintained their discipline. They had learned from previous battles that American bombardments, however impressive, rarely eliminated determined defenders who had prepared properly. Emperor Hirohito himself had declared that Saipan must be held at all costs, making this not just a military objective, but a sacred duty that would be defended with the full fury of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. As the first wave of landing craft approached the reef line, both sides knew that the next few hours would determine the fate of the Pacific War itself. The first Marines hit Red Beach at 0843 hours, their landing craft grinding against the coral reef as Japanese artillery found its range. With deadly precision, what had appeared to be a devastated wasteland from the sea revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated killing field, with hidden gun positions opening fire from concealed bunkers that had survived the massive bombardment. The crystal-clear water quickly turned crimson as Marines struggled through chest-deep surf, while machine gun fire swept across the beach like a scythe through wheat. Sergeant William Hawkins of the 2nd Marine Division was among the first to reach dry sand, his boots sinking into the volcanic black beach as mortar rounds exploded around his squad. The Japanese had learned from their defeats at Tarawa and Kwajalein, positioning their main defensive line inland rather than on the beach itself, allowing the Americans to land before unleashing concentrated firepower from prepared positions. The deception was brutally effective, as Marines who expected to face the heaviest resistance at the water's edge found themselves caught in the open under withering crossfire from multiple directions. The 4th Marine Division, landing on the southern beaches, encountered similar resistance as they pushed inland through sugarcane fields that provided perfect concealment for Japanese snipers and machine gun nests. Private First Class Robert Campbell later recalled the surreal experience of advancing through the tall cane stalks, never knowing if the next step would trigger a hidden mine or draw fire from an invisible enemy who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. The Japanese defenders, many of them Korean laborers who had been pressed into service alongside regular army units, fought with a desperation born from knowledge that capture meant certain death. Lieutenant General Sato had positioned his forces according to a defense-in-depth strategy that maximized the island's natural advantages. The coastal plain, where the Americans had to establish their beachhead, was dominated by a series of ridges and hills that provided excellent observation and fields of fire. Mount Tapachau, rising over 1,500 feet above sea level, served as the anchor of the defensive system, its caves and tunnels sheltering artillery pieces that could rain destruction on any area of the island. According to documentation from the Marine Corps' Historical Center, casualties in the first 48 hours exceeded all projections, with some companies losing more than half their strength before reaching their initial objectives. The Japanese had prepared multiple defensive lines, each one requiring a separate assault that consumed men and materials at an alarming rate. Medical corpsmen worked frantically to evacuate the wounded through surf that remained under constant artillery fire, their Red Cross markings providing no protection from an enemy that had abandoned conventional rules of warfare. The naval battle offshore added another dimension to the unfolding catastrophe. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet was approaching from the west, seeking to trap the American invasion force between shore-based defenses and carrier-based aircraft in what Japanese planners called Operation to Go. The prospect of fighting a two-front battle while maintaining the amphibious assault created enormous pressure on American commanders, who had to balance the immediate tactical needs of the Marines ashore with the strategic requirement to defeat the Japanese fleet. Colonel James Risley, commanding the 23rd Marine Regiment, established his command post in a shell crater just 500 yards inland from the beach, close enough to hear individual rifle shots from the front lines. Communications proved nearly impossible as radio equipment was destroyed by artillery fire, and telephone lines were severed by the constant bombardment. Orders had to be carried by runners who faced deadly sprints across open ground, swept by machine gun fire, creating a command and control nightmare that threatened to paralyze the entire operation. As darkness fell on the first day, American forces held a precarious foothold on Saipan's western shore, but the real battle for the island had barely begun. Dawn of June 16th brought no respite for the Marines clinging to their shallow beachhead, as Japanese artillery observers on Mount Tapachau directed devastating, accurate fire onto every American position. The volcanic ridges that dominated the island's interior had been transformed into an impregnable fortress system, with interconnected caves and tunnels allowing defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts, striking without warning before melting back into the honeycomb of underground positions. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the 4th Marine Division, faced the seemingly impossible task of advancing across 3 miles of sugarcane fields. While under constant observation from elevated positions, every movement drew immediate artillery response, and the dense vegetation that provided concealment also hid countless Japanese strong points that had to be reduced one by one in close combat, requiring small teams to approach within yards of enemy positions under covering fire from supporting units. The Japanese defensive strategy relied heavily on night infiltration tactics, designed to disrupt American operations and inflict maximum casualties on isolated units. Colonel Takeshi Takashina, commanding the 43rd Division, had trained his men extensively in these techniques, emphasizing individual initiative and the importance of making every American pay dearly for each yard of ground. Japanese soldiers would slip through Marine lines under cover of darkness, attacking command posts, destroying equipment, and creating panic in rear areas before disappearing back into the jungle. Private Robert Sherrod, a war correspondent embedded with the assault forces, documented the psychological toll of fighting an enemy who seemed to materialize from the earth itself. According to his dispatches published in Time magazine, Marines reported a constant sense of being watched by invisible eyes, never knowing when a concealed sniper might end their lives with a single shot. The traditional American advantages in firepower and mobility meant little against an enemy who had turned the entire island into a three-dimensional battlefield, where the front lines existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien led a desperate assault against a key Japanese position known as Purple Heart Ridge. The attack required Marines to advance up a steep slope while under direct fire from multiple directions, with no cover except for shell craters and scattered boulders. O'Brien himself was killed leading the final charge, but his sacrifice inspired his men to overrun the position and establish the first significant penetration of the Japanese defensive line. The cost was horrific, with O'Brien's battalion suffering 70% casualties. but the tactical victory opened the corridor toward the island's interior. Naval gunfire support proved crucial during this phase of the battle, with destroyers moving close and short to provide direct fire against specific targets identified by Marine forward observers. The USS California and USS Pennsylvania used their 14-inch guns to systematically destroy Japanese positions on the reverse slopes of ridges that were invisible to ground forces, creating gaps in the defensive line that infantry could exploit. However, the Japanese had learned to construct their fortifications with multiple chambers and escape routes, allowing survivors to reoccupy positions after the bombardment lifted. The civilian population of Saipan, caught between the opposing forces, faced an impossible choice between American captivity and Japanese demands for mass suicide. Thousands of Korean and Japanese civilians had been impressed into military service, making it nearly impossible for Marines to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in the chaos of battle. This tragic situation would haunt both sides throughout the campaign, as military necessity collided with humanitarian concerns in ways that defied easy resolution. Medical evacuation became increasingly difficult as Japanese artillery interdicted the beaches, where wounded Marines awaited transport to hospital ships offshore. Corpsmen like pharmacist mate John Bradley risked their lives repeatedly to carry wounded comrades across fire-swept terrain to aid stations that were themselves under constant threat of attack, while Marines bled and died in the sugarcane fields of Saipan. A parallel drama unfolded in the Philippine Sea as Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet approached with 9 aircraft carriers and over 400 planes, intent on crushing the American invasion fleet in what Japanese planners believed would be the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Raymond Spruance faced a terrible dilemma: maintain his carriers close to Saipan to support the Marines or sail west to engage the Japanese fleet before it could coordinate with land-based aircraft from Guam and the Philippines. The Japanese plan, designated Operation Ago, represented their last realistic chance to achieve a major naval victory that might force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace settlement. Admiral Ozawa commanded a formidable force including the supercarriers Taiho and Shokaku, veteran ships that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns across the Pacific. However, the Japanese faced a critical shortage of experienced pilots, having lost many of their best aviators in previous battles, while American pilot training programs had produced a steady stream of skilled replacements. On June 19th, the battle began when Japanese reconnaissance aircraft detected Task Force 58, approximately 180 miles west of Saipan. Ozawa immediately launched his first strike wave of 69 aircraft, confident that his planes could overwhelm American defenses and sink enough ships to cripple the invasion. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American fighter pilots, flying superior Grumman F-6F Hellcats, systematically destroyed Japanese attack formations before they could reach their targets. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, flying from the USS Essex, shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, exemplifying the skill and determination of American naval aviators who had trained extensively for exactly this type of battle. According to official Navy records cited by historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, Japanese losses in the first day of aerial combat exceeded 300 aircraft, while American losses totaled fewer than 30 planes. The disparity reflected not only superior equipment, but also the comprehensive training programs that had prepared American pilots for the complex demands of carrier warfare. The Japanese suffered another catastrophic blow when the USS Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho, flagship of Admiral Ozawa's fleet. The massive ship, pride of the Imperial Navy, was torn apart by internal explosions caused by aviation fuel vapors that had accumulated after the torpedo damage. The loss of the Taiho, along with the veteran carrier Shokaku, which was sunk by the submarine USS Kavala, effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as an offensive force, capable of challenging American supremacy in the Pacific. Admiral Spruance's decision to maintain defensive positions rather than pursuing the retreating Japanese fleet drew criticism from some officers, who believed that a more aggressive pursuit might have destroyed the entire enemy force. However, Spruance's primary mission was protecting the amphibious forces at Saipan, and his cautious approach ensured that the Marines ashore continued to receive essential naval gunfire support during their desperate struggle against Japanese ground forces. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation had immediate implications for the battle on Saipan, as General Sato could no longer expect air support from the combined fleet. This strategic isolation forced Japanese ground commanders to rely entirely on their own resources, eliminating any possibility of coordinated air-sea-land operations that might have turned the tide of battle. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was equally significant, as the failure of Operation Ago demonstrated that their homeland was now vulnerable to direct attack. News of the naval victory reached Marines on Saipan through radio broadcasts. That provided a crucial morale boost during some of the heaviest fighting of the campaign. However, the Japanese defenders, now facing certain doom, fought with even greater desperation, knowing that defeat would leave Japan's home islands defenseless against American bombers based in the Marianas. The collapse of Operation Ago transformed the battle for Saipan into a desperate last stand, as General Sato's forces, now completely cut off from reinforcement or resupply, prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. In accordance with the ancient warrior code of Bushido, the Japanese commander issued orders that no position was to be abandoned without express permission, and that death in battle was preferable to the shame of surrender, setting the stage for some of the most brutal fighting in Pacific War history. American forces, strengthened by the arrival of the 27th Infantry Division under Major General Ralph Smith, began a systematic advance northward from the consolidated beachhead, employing combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and naval gunfire into coordinated attacks against specific objectives. The terrain favored the defenders at every turn, with each ridge line and valley requiring separate assault operations that consumed enormous quantities of ammunition and medical supplies while producing casualty rates that shocked even veteran commanders. Launched a coordinated assault against the key defensive positions that controlled access to the island's central highlands. Colonel Stewart, commanding the 6th Marine Regiment, later described the advance as the most difficult fighting his unit had experienced. Flamethrower teams became essential for reducing Japanese bunkers and cave positions, but the operators faced extraordinary dangers, as they had to approach within 30 feet of their targets, while carrying highly explosive fuel tanks that made them priority targets for enemy snipers and machine gunners. Corporal Joseph Vittori, operating a flamethrower during the assault on Purple Heart Ridge, single-handedly destroyed 6 Japanese positions before being killed by artillery fire, exemplifying the individual heroism that characterized the entire campaign. Documentation from the Army Historical Foundation reveals that Japanese defensive tactics evolved throughout the battle, with increasing emphasis on small unit infiltration attacks designed to disrupt American supply lines and create panic in rear areas. These night raids proved particularly effective against inexperienced units of the 27th Infantry Division, leading to tensions between Marine and Army commanders over tactical doctrine and unit reliability. Under extreme combat conditions, the civilian tragedy reached its climax during the final week of June as thousands of Japanese and Korean civilians, caught between advancing American forces and retreating Japanese troops, faced impossible choices between surrender and mass suicide. Emperor Hirohito's pronouncements about the sacred duty to die rather than face capture had been thoroughly indoctrinated into the civilian population, creating situations where entire families chose death over what they had been taught to believe would be torture and execution at American hands. Medical personnel on both sides struggled to cope with casualty rates that exceeded all previous Pacific campaigns. American field hospitals, established in former Japanese defensive positions, operated under constant threat of artillery fire and infiltration attacks, while Japanese wounded received little medical attention as their army's medical corps had collapsed under the weight of continuous combat. The primitive conditions and tropical diseases added another dimension of suffering to an already horrific situation. The psychological toll on American troops became increasingly apparent as the battle entered its 4th week, with many Marines showing signs of combat fatigue that military psychiatrists were only beginning to understand. The constant stress of fighting an enemy who refused to surrender, combined with the tropical heat and humidity, created conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal limits. Rotation policies that had worked in other campaigns proved inadequate for the sustained intensity of the Saipan operation. Japanese resistance began to crumble by late June as ammunition shortages and the complete breakdown of command and control made coordinated defense impossible, setting the stage for the final, tragic climax of the battle. The end began with whispers in the pre-dawn darkness of July 7th, as the remnants of General Sato's command prepared for their final act of defiance against the advancing American forces. With ammunition nearly exhausted and no hope of reinforcement or escape, The Japanese commander made the decision that would define the last chapter of the Saipan campaign, a massive banzai charge involving every soldier capable of bearing arms, designed not to achieve victory, but to die with honor while inflicting maximum casualties on their enemies. General Sato, mortally wounded and no longer able to command effectively, passed operational control to Colonel Takeshi Takashina with simple instructions: gather every available man for one final assault that would demonstrate Japanese warrior spirit to the world. The plan was tactically hopeless, but spiritually necessary according to Bushido tradition, which demanded death before dishonor and viewed surrender as a fate worse than annihilation. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded and barely able to walk, assembled in the pre-dawn darkness for what they knew would be their last battle. The target selected for this final assault was the sector held by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, positioned near the village of Tanapa on Saipan's northern coast. These American soldiers, many of them National Guard troops with limited combat experience, had been holding defensive positions for several days, while Marine units conducted the main assault operations further inland. The choice proved tactically sound from the Japanese perspective, as these troops were less experienced in repelling mass infantry attacks than their Marine counterparts. At 0 for 15 hours, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War erupted from the darkness like a scene from medieval warfare transplanted into the modern era. Japanese soldiers, many armed only with bamboo spears, bayonets, or clubs, charged across open ground toward American positions while shouting traditional battle cries that echoed across the tropical landscape. Some carried explosives strapped to their bodies, intending to destroy American equipment even at the cost of their own lives, while others wielded samurai swords that had been family heirlooms for centuries. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commanding the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, had positioned his men in defensive positions along a ridge line overlooking the assembly area, where Japanese forces had concentrated. According to after-action reports preserved in the National Archives, American forces initially mistook the sounds of Japanese preparation for normal nighttime activity, until the massive assault wave became visible in the dim light of early dawn. The sheer number of attacking Japanese soldiers initially overwhelmed several American positions. Through pure momentum and desperate courage, the battle devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat as Japanese soldiers, who survived the initial machine gun and artillery fire, closed with American defenders. In fighting so intense that individual acts of heroism became impossible to distinguish from the general carnage, Private First Class Harold Schreier, manning a machine gun position, continued firing until Japanese soldiers reached his foxhole, then fought with pistol and bayonet until mortally wounded while defending his wounded comrades. Such individual sacrifices multiplied across the entire battlefield. As the banzai charge reached its climax, American artillery and naval gunfire eventually broke the back of the Japanese assault, but not before entire companies had been overrun, and hundreds of soldiers on both sides had been killed in close combat that resembled something from the American Civil War rather than a modern Pacific battle. The Japanese charge succeeded in penetrating American lines in several locations, creating temporary panic and confusion that required the commitment of reserve forces to restore the situation. When dawn fully revealed the battlefield, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of American positions, their bodies testimony to the futility and tragedy of the banzai charge. General Sato, unable to witness the final destruction of his command, had committed ritual suicide in his command cave, leaving behind a final message expressing regret that he could not defend the emperor's territory more effectively. The Battle of Saipan was essentially over, though scattered Japanese resistance would continue for several more days. The silence that settled over Saipan on July 9, 1944, carried the weight of 24 days of unprecedented carnage that had transformed a tropical paradise into a graveyard where over 30,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lay dead, alongside more than 3,000 American servicemen. The magnitude of destruction exceeded anything previously witnessed in the Pacific War, establishing a grim precedent for the battles that would follow. As American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands, Lieutenant General Holland Smith, surveying the battlefield from his command post overlooking the now quiet sugarcane fields, struggled to comprehend the human cost of victory. The Marines and soldiers under his command had accomplished their mission with extraordinary courage and determination, But the price paid in blood raised disturbing questions about the nature of warfare in the modern era. Every cave, every bunker, every defensive position had to be taken by direct assault, often involving hand-to-hand combat that tested the limits of human endurance and moral resilience. The civilian tragedy that unfolded during the final days of battle shocked even hardened combat veterans who had witnessed the worst aspects of modern warfare, chose mass suicide rather than face capture, creating scenes of horror that would haunt American servicemen for the rest of their lives. Entire families leaped from cliffs into the sea, while others detonated explosives in caves where they had taken shelter, preferring death to what they had been taught to believe would be torture. In execution, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations, recognized immediately that the fall of Saipan represented a strategic turning point that brought American bombers within range of the Japanese home islands for the first time since the Doolittle raid of 1942. The new Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers, with their extended range and massive bomb loads, could now reach Tokyo from bases in the Mariana Islands, transforming the entire strategic balance in the Pacific and making Japanese defeat inevitable, regardless of their willingness to continue fighting. According to historical analysis published by the Naval War College, the Japanese government understood the implications of Saipan's fall better than many Americans realized at the time. Emperor Hirohito's private comments, recorded in his personal diary and later made available to historians, revealed his recognition that the war had become unwinnable from a strategic perspective. Though political and cultural pressures prevented any immediate move toward peace negotiations, the military leadership, however, remained committed to fighting until the bitter end, regardless of the consequences for the Japanese people. The aftermath of the battle revealed the tremendous logistical achievement required to sustain amphibious operations on such a massive scale across thousands of miles of ocean. American supply lines had delivered millions of rounds of ammunition, tens of thousands of tons of food and medical supplies, and replacement equipment for units that had lost most of their original gear during the fighting. The naval construction battalions, known as Seabees, began building airfields and port facilities even before the last Japanese resistance had been eliminated, demonstrating the forward momentum that characterized American operations throughout the Pacific campaign. Medical advances developed during the Saipan campaign, particularly in the treatment of traumatic wounds and combat fatigue, would save thousands of lives in subsequent operations. The establishment of forward surgical hospitals and the use of blood plasma for treating shock victims represented significant improvements over previous medical practices, while psychiatric treatment for combat exhaustion began to receive serious attention from military medical personnel who recognized the psychological toll of sustained combat operations. The Battle of Saipan established the template for the even more horrific battles that would follow. At Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders would employ similar tactics of defense in depth, combined with mass suicide attacks designed to inflict maximum casualties on American forces. The strategic lesson learned was that Japanese resistance would intensify rather than weaken as American forces approached the home islands, making the eventual decision to use atomic weapons almost inevitable. Given the projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, the victory at Saipan, purchased with such terrible sacrifice, opened the door to ultimate Allied triumph in the Pacific War, but at a cost in human suffering that would forever change how Americans viewed the nature of modern warfare and their responsibilities as a global power in the atomic age.